Welcome to our Devos. We are looking at the subject of being united. Yesterday, we talked about how there are times when we are called not to be united, specifically when someone is in heresy and when they don't believe in Jesus. But now we are going to look at what we do with those other people that we are maybe not on the same page with in every area, but we know that they love God. We know that they're reading the Bible. They might be off. There's error or maybe disagreement on our part. How do we weed through that? Well, it's simple. When we start off looking at those that love God, we focus on what's right. Yes, focus on what's right. I had a conversation this week with someone on staff, and they had visited a church that was different than ours when it comes to some doctrine. They believe in Jesus, they preach the gospel, they believe in the Bible as authority, but there were some things that they did in the church. I'm not even going to mention it because it's not worth it for the division. There were some things that they would do as a part of the worship service that would kind of be uncomfortable if that was presented here. So what I said when this person was like, yeah, they were doing this in the service and the preacher said this, and it was a little uncomfortable. And this is what I said. I said, this church blows most churches out of the water when it comes to hospitality. They love their people. They're reaching out to people. They're serving their members. They're caring for the people. And I focused on what they were doing biblically that was right in terms of hospitality, in terms of preaching the gospel, in terms of loving other people. And focusing on what was right enabled us to direct the conversation in a way where God was honored and unity was preserved. So it says here in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 12, it says, the Apostle Paul writes, so with yourselves, since you are eager for manifestations of the Spirit, strive to excel in building up the church. So he's talking there about the whole discourse from 1 Corinthians 12 through 14, including the famous love chapter in 13, is a dealing about spiritual gifts. Now, you want to talk about a divisive thing in the church today, it's the manifestations of spiritual gifts. But in the midst of this kind of controversial discussion, Paul talks about the essence, and he says, strive to excel in building up the church. So often, what do we do? When we talk about other churches, what do we say? Other Bible teaching churches, not churches that aren't preaching the gospel, refer to yesterday with heresy, but churches that, you know what they do at that church? Their services are like 4 hours long. Sometimes I wonder what that would be like. I see people checking their watches very nervously around 11:59. They're like, what's going on here? It looks like we're not rounding out to home base pretty soon. I always wonder what it would be like when some of those churches do that. And what we do when we talk about other churches is, what do? We talk about what they do that's weird than what we do. They're like, you know what that church does? They do this. Do you know that church? They do foot washing in that church. Do you know what that church does? They take communion, and the way they do it is they put it at the end of the service, and people stay there for 2 hours, and they have a meal. Like, you pick all these things out that's different from you. Well, no. Stop doing that. Don't do that. I mean that. God doesn't want us doing this. God wants us to focus on the strengths of what the church is doing. And that's what promotes unity. When you look and you can recognize that there are things that God is doing in their midst. And I'm not saying they're perfect. Remember, if there was a perfect church, you wouldn't be allowed to go there. I wouldn't be allowed to preach there. So it's about focusing on what the Lord is doing in that church. Focus on what's right and excel for the building up of the church.